At 4:18 on a Wednesday morning, black water pushed through the red doors of my calving barn and lifted a stack of feed pans off the floor. They struck the stone wall one after another, a slow metal clatter beneath the rain. Beyond the lower meadow, 2 yellow diesel pumps worked under portable lights. Their black hoses crossed my fence from the Northcrest Hills detention basin and pulsed like arteries. I was moving the last cows toward higher ground when Elaine Porter arrived in a white utility vehicle. She did not shout. She stood under a burgundy raincoat, opened a slim black folio, and handed me an emergency water control notice through the fence. "The association is exercising its drainage rights," she said. "Do not interfere with community flood protection." The notice was dated 4 days earlier. There had been no emergency 4 days earlier. I looked past her toward the lawful east outlet of the basin. Someone had bolted dark steel plates over it. Water that should have moved toward the county ditch was being held high enough for the pumps to force it west, onto my ranch. Elaine told me 92 households were depending on my cooperation. I did not answer. I photographed the notice, the pump serial plates, the hoses, and a brass survey disc in the old basalt wall. Water stood 18 inches above the disc. Its stamped number was still visible beneath my flashlight, BM 417.2. I did not yet know why that number mattered. I only knew the water had never reached it before. The barn alarm kept sounding as I walked back into the current. Red Alder Ranch had flood procedures, and I followed them in order. I opened the north pen, cut power to the lower barn at the exterior disconnect, and counted every animal after my ranch hand led them through the gravel lane. Then, I called the county emergency number and reported moving water, blocked public drainage equipment, and industrial pumps discharging across a private boundary. I did not say sabotage. I did not say fraud. I described what I could see. For 34 years, I had planned maintenance for a regional irrigation district. My job had involved gates, pumps, culverts, inspection schedules, and the quiet consequences of deferred work. A failed seal did not care who chaired a meeting. Water followed elevation, pressure, and the opening someone gave it. When something went wrong, we preserved the original state before making repairs. Time, weather, equipment number, valve position, watermark, baseline first, action second. That habit kept me from pulling the hoses apart. The urge was there. Each hose was dumping water into the upper edge of the lower meadow, where the flow gathered against an irrigation berm and spread toward the barn. A knife through the rubber would have slowed it. It also would have destroyed evidence, endangered the workers, and allowed Elaine to say, I had caused whatever happened next. I stayed on my side of the fence and recorded one continuous video without speaking. At 4:41, a contractor in orange waterproofs approached. He would not give me his name, but he pointed to the notice in my hand and said the board had approved an emergency bypass. I asked whether he had a county permit for the steel plates over the east outlet. He looked uphill rather than at me. We work for the association, he said. That answered a different question. By dawn, the lower meadow had become a shallow moving lake. Water carried bark mulch, plastic irrigation fittings, and gray silt from the subdivision construction area. The current folded 300 feet of fence into the grass. It had entered the machinery shed, covered the electrical panels in the seed cleaning room, and surrounded the stone barn on 3 sides. No person was injured. No animal was lost. That fact mattered more than anything I later put into a court file. At 6:12, an Alder County Public Works supervisor arrived with 2 road employees. The supervisor walked first to the east outlet, photographed the steel plates, and asked Elaine for the encroachment permit. Elaine gave him the same calm explanation she had given me. She said Northcrest was acting under a recorded drainage easement and that the plates were temporary safety controls. He told her the county ditch was not controlled by the HOA. He also told the pump operator to shut both engines down until the county could inspect the outlet. Elaine objected in the language of administration. She referred to resident safety, emergency discretion, and potential liability if the basin overtopped near the homes. The supervisor did not debate the easement. That was not his role. He said his authority was limited to the county outlet and the unpermitted obstruction installed on it. Then he directed his crew to remove the plates. The first pump fell silent at 6:27. The second stopped 3 minutes later. When the plates came away, brown water burst into the east ditch with enough force to shake the culvert rail. The basin level began to fall. On my side, the current softened from a push to a slow spread. It was an early victory of the smallest kind. The active discharge had ended. Nothing else had been decided. Elaine stood beside her vehicle and watched the county crew. Before leaving, she told me the association would hold me responsible if my interference caused damage uphill. I wrote her exact words in my yellow waterproof notebook, along with the time she saw me do it. "You are turning a safety problem into a legal problem, Mr. Barrett," she said. "I am recording a flood," I replied. That was our entire conversation. My name is Owen Barrett. I was 63 when Northcrest Hills turned my lower meadow into its emergency outlet. Red Alder Ranch covered 640 acres in Alder County, Oregon, below the wooded bench where the subdivision had been built. The ranch had belonged to my grandparents, then my parents, and finally to my wife, Ruth, and me. An appraiser had valued it at $6 million the previous spring, but that figure did not explain why I stayed. The old calving barn did. My father and grandfather built its basalt walls by hand. Ruth restored the roof after we married and painted the sliding doors a red so dark it looked brown in winter rain. Years later, when her illness made long walks difficult, we put a bench beneath the south eave. From there, she could see the lower meadow, the creek, and the line of alders turning gold each October. After she died, I kept the bench where it was. I never treated it like a memorial. It was simply part of the barn, and the barn was part of the work. That morning, the water reached the lower edge of the bench. Northcrest Hills had not existed when my family built the barn. Its first homes appeared in the late 1990s on a former timber parcel above us. The developer needed a place for ordinary rainwater to pass after roads and roofs replaced absorbent ground. My parents agreed to a narrow recorded easement in 1999. It allowed historic sheet flow through a vegetated swale near our northern boundary, at no more than the pre-development rate. The arrangement was modest. Rain moved downhill as it always had. The association maintained the swale. My family kept ownership of the land. The document did not give Northcrest a reservoir, a storage basin, or a route for pumped water. It did not place our ranch inside the HOA. It did not authorize anyone to enter our fields. For more than 20 years, the system worked because the subdivision's discharged through its eastern outlet into a county roadside ditch. Only light overflow reached our swale during the wettest weeks. I checked the boundary every winter. The west inspection culvert above our meadow normally held leaves and field mice, not moving water. 4 months before the flood, that changed. I noticed fresh survey paint beside the culvert and 2 tire tracks leading from the Northcrest maintenance road. I photographed both and entered them in my monthly boundary log. The HOA manager later told me a contractor was conducting a routine drainage review. I had no reason then to dispute it. By 8 that morning, I had a reason. I stood inside the wet barn, listening to water drip from the electrical boxes, and opened the emergency water control notice again. The heading said an immediate threat required temporary measures. The signature at the bottom belonged to Elaine. The date at the top came before the storm warning had been issued. That was the first contradiction in my file. Miriam Calder arrived. Before noon, she had represented the irrigation district on 2 easement disputes while I still worked there, and she understood that water cases were usually decided by small verbs. May pass was not may store. Maintain was not enlarge. Access for inspection was not permission to occupy. She stopped at the ranch gate and put on rubber boots before taking 1 step into the mud. Her first instruction was not to clean anything that could safely remain in place. Her second was to separate emergency repairs from permanent work. We could remove wet feed, stabilize the animals, and protect the well. We would not reshape the meadow or repair the irrigation berm until an independent engineer had measured it. Together we walked a line from the stone barn to the boundary. I showed her the hoses, the pump plates, the steel outlet covers stacked beside the county truck, and the brass benchmark. She photographed my notebook beside each object, so the time entries could be matched to the physical condition. Then she placed the original notice in a clear sleeve and made a working copy. "Do you have the 1999 easement?" she asked. "Recorded copy and the closing file. Keep both, do not mark them." Miriam called Northcrest's attorney from the gravel lane. She gave notice that we would seek inspection of the pump controllers, rental records, board authorization, basin logs, weather communications, and every version of the emergency notice. She also sent a preservation letter before the equipment left the site. The contractor could remove fuel and secure the pumps, but not erase their operating history. Elaine's response came within an hour. Through counsel, Northcrest denied directing water onto the ranch. The letter described the pumps as precautionary equipment, staged by an independent contractor. It also said, any water reaching my land had followed the historic drainage path protected by the easement. I read the paragraph twice. At dawn, Elaine had said the association was exercising its drainage rights. By noon, her attorney said the contractor had merely staged equipment, and natural water had done the rest. I noted both statements. I did not answer either one. The first damage estimate was not a final number. It was a list of systems that could no longer be trusted. The seed cleaning motors had been submerged. The lower electrical service needed replacement. Mud had entered the well enclosure, though testing would be required before anyone could say whether the water itself was contaminated. 28 acres of certified seed hay lay under gray sediment from outside the ranch. Buyers would not accept it until the source was identified. The stone barn remained standing, but water had washed material from beneath one corner of the slab. My insurer sent an adjuster the next day. He was polite and careful. He photographed everything, then explained that the policy treated ordinary storm runoff differently from water deliberately collected and discharged by another party. Until causation was established, the company would reserve its rights. That meant it would investigate, without promising payment. The distinction was reasonable on paper. In practice, it left me paying for temporary fencing, electrical work, veterinary boarding, laboratory testing, and a portable water tank while the argument developed. Northcrest moved faster than the laboratories. On the second afternoon, every resident received a board bulletin titled Flood Safety Incident. It said a downstream landowner had obstructed a recognized drainage corridor and caused the association to suspend emergency protection. It asked residents not to approach the ranch and warned that additional assessments might be necessary if the landowner continued legal action. My name appeared in the third paragraph. I did not post a reply. Miriam requested the bulletin, its distribution list, and the records supporting each statement. Then I added it to the binder behind the notice and the 2 letters. Facts did not improve because they were delivered to 92 inboxes. They only became easier to authenticate. 3 evenings after the flood, Northcrest held an emergency board meeting in its clubhouse. The association's rules did not give me a right to vote, but Elaine allowed Miriam and me 5 minutes as affected landowners. The room was full. Many residents were retired. Several had bought uphill. Because the neighborhood promised maintained roads and reliable drainage, they had reason to fear water. Elaine used that fear carefully. She stood beside a projected map that shaded my lower meadow blue. The image identified it as a natural receiving area. She explained that Northcrest had acted to prevent the detention basin from reaching homes, and that my insistence on closing the west route placed the entire community at risk. We cannot allow one neighboring owner to veto the safety of 92 families, she said. Her tone was measured. No one hearing only that sentence would have considered it unreasonable. When my time began, Miriam placed a large copy of the easement on an easel. I read one line, ordinary historic sheet flow, not exceeding the pre-development discharge rate. Then I asked 3 questions. Who ordered the lawful east outlet covered? Who signed for the 2 pumps? What measurement showed their discharge stayed below the recorded limit? Elaine said operational details were being reviewed. A board member beside her said the contractor controlled field methods. Their attorney objected that the questions concerned pending litigation. Though no lawsuit had yet been filed, I used the remainder of my time to make one point. I did not close your outlet, I said. I did not place pumps above my meadow. I am asking for the records of the people who did. There was no applause. A man in the front row asked whether his home insurance was at risk. A woman near the aisle asked how much a drainage repair would cost. Elaine told them those questions showed why the board needed freedom to act during emergencies. After the meeting, she caught us near the door. She offered a temporary agreement. Northcrest would contribute to cleanup if I granted immediate access to inspect and improve the west route. The agreement described my meadow as a secondary detention area and allowed the association to install permanent controls there. Miriam handed it back without comment. Elaine looked at me. You can have assistance now, or spend years proving a technical point. The water is not technical to me, I said. The next morning, Northcrest filed a civil complaint in the Circuit Court of the State of Oregon for the County of Alder, seeking a declaration that its easement included emergency discharge and inspection access. It also requested an order preventing me from altering the irrigation berm. The board had turned its offer into a demand before the mud in the barn had dried. Miriam filed our response and a counterclaim for trespass, nuisance, property damage, and injunctive relief. Oregon law allowed ordinary drainage to follow a natural path under limits, but it did not silently authorize a neighbor to block one outlet, collect runoff with machinery, change the discharge point, and concentrate it onto another part of private land. Miriam did not ask the judge to decide 13 questions at once. First, we wanted the equipment logs preserved. Second, we wanted Northcrest kept off the ranch. Third, we wanted the lawful east outlet to remain open while the case proceeded. The court issued a narrow temporary order. Neither side could alter the disputed berm or west culvert. Northcrest could not discharge through the pumps or enter my property. The county outlet had to remain unobstructed. The order protected the next week, not the final outcome. Elaine called it a balanced result in another bulletin. She did not mention that the pumps were forbidden. By then, 2 seed buyers had suspended our contracts. The laboratory found petroleum residue and construction sediment in the lower field, enough to require removal and retesting before certification. My line of credit remained open, but the bank asked for weekly updates. Every quiet administrative sentence produced a real task, a real invoice, or another day when the ranch could not operate normally. I kept working from the upper barn. Each evening, I transferred field notes into a dated index. Photographs went into folders by location. Letters went behind the documents they answered. I kept the original memory cards in separate envelopes and gave Miriam exact copies. The binder did not feel like a weapon. It felt like maintenance. Colin Webb began his inspection 6 days after the flood. He was 66, broad through the shoulders, and patient with instruments. He had spent most of his career designing municipal drainage systems, and the last decade explaining failed ones. He did not begin with the watermarks inside the barn. He began uphill at the basin. The county allowed him to inspect the public outlet, while its supervisor watched. The 2 steel plates had covered the low-level openings completely. Their bolt holes matched fresh anchors in the concrete headwall. Rust dust around the washers showed they had been tightened before the storm, not placed loosely during it. On the western side, flattened grass traced the path from the rented pumps to the inspection culvert. The hose impressions stopped at the ranch fence. Colin measured the basin lip, the east outlet, the west culvert, the swale, my irrigation berm, and every surviving high water line. He tied the measurements to 3 recorded survey points. The brass disc in the basalt wall was one of them. BM means benchmark, he said. The number is an elevation used when this system was designed. I asked whether the water above it proved the pumps caused the flood. It proves the water surface reached a known height, he said. Causation takes more than one height. That answer was less satisfying than certainty and more useful. Colin requested the original drainage calculations from the county archive. The paper plan showed Northcrest's lawful outlet on the east side and the vegetated overflow swale near our boundary. A table limited the subdivision's release to the rate expected before the streets and homes were built. The west inspection culvert appeared on the plan, but it was labeled maintenance access, normally dry. Its floor sat higher than the historic overflow line. That detail supported us, but it did not close the case. Northcrest could still argue the storm raised water naturally above the line. It could also argue my irrigation berm slowed the water after it arrived. Increasing the depth around the barn, the weather records mattered. Rain had been heavy across Alder County, though not extraordinary for February. A county gauge less than 2 miles away recorded a steady event rather than a sudden cloudburst. Lokeland entered the data into his model and refused to show us a conclusion until he had verified the basin dimensions twice. While he worked outside, Miriam worked through the documents. Northcrest's first production contained minutes, inspection reports, invoices, and the easement. Missing attachments and flattened electronic records forced us to rebuild the sequence ourselves. The annual reserve study showed Northcrest had known for more than a year that the east outlet was corroded and partly undersized. It recommended a full retrofit, warned that any temporary bypass must use an approved public route, and projected a cost above $2 million. Board minutes showed the directors had postponed the project twice. Elaine had argued that an immediate special assessment would hurt older residents and depress home sales. That concern was not invented. Many Northcrest owners lived on fixed incomes. A large bill would have been difficult for them. But Elaine had another interest. Her brokerage listed homes inside Northcrest. In disclosure forms in the production, showed buyers had not been told the basin needed major work. Acknowledging the defect during pending sales would have required new disclosures and could have delayed closings. The same month the board delayed the retrofit. Elaine's office had several Northcrest listings under contract. The motive was no longer a desire to take my land. It was narrower, and to me more believable. The board had a costly drainage problem. Elaine had personal and political reasons to keep it quiet. My lower meadow, offered a place to put water without sending a special assessment to her neighbors or a defect notice to her clients. Miriam found the phrase temporary off-site relief in a consultant's email. The attachment was missing. We asked for it. Northcrest answered that the phrase referred to conceptual options and that no final off-site design had been approved. Its attorney repeated that the contractor selected field routing during an emergency. Then the association produced its own engineering report. The report changed the balance again. Northcrest's engineer agreed that pumps had operated. He did not agree they caused most of the damage. His model treated the west culvert as part of the natural overflow system and assumed the lower meadow would have flooded once the basin reached capacity. It also treated my irrigation berm as a barrier that trapped water near the stone barn. Under his calculation, the pumps shortened the arrival time, but did not materially change the final depth. If that interpretation survived, Northcrest might face limited trespass liability, while my maintenance carried much of the flood damage. Colin and I inspected the irrigation berm. Ruth and I had rebuilt 12 years earlier. It stood less than 2 feet high, had 3 broad spill gaps, and appeared in annual photographs. My last complete set, however, was 10 months old. Could it have trapped the water? I asked. Some, Colin said. Anything. Above ground changes, flow enough to flood the barn? That depends on how much arrived and at what elevation. Again, he would not give me the sentence I wanted. Northcrest's model placed the top of the berm 8 inches higher than Colin's field survey. It also placed the brass benchmark lower than the elevation on the recorded plan. The engineer explained both differences as conversions between older and newer vertical reference systems. Such conversions are real. A number on a 30-year-old plan cannot always be dropped into modern software without adjustment. For the first time, BM 417.2 looked less like an answer and more like another dispute. The association used its report immediately. Elaine sent residents a summary stating that independent analysis had identified unapproved ranch modifications as the primary cause of downstream damage. She then asked the board to approve a legal fund and a temporary assessment. Several residents wrote with fair questions about the berm, earlier floods, and the east outlet. I answered through Miriam with photographs, maintenance records, and the temporary order. The county found no permit violation because the berm was an agricultural feature outside the regulated stream channel. That removed one accusation, not the causation dispute. The next document came from the pump rental company. Each unit contained a controller that recorded engine hours, flow estimates, alarm conditions, and start and stop commands. The vendor preserved the data after Miriam's letter. Together, the pumps had operated for most of the night and moved a volume far above ordinary sheet flow. Northcrest did not deny the numbers. It changed its argument. The board said, the volume represented water that would have crossed the boundary anyway, and the pumps merely prevented an uncontrolled basin failure that might have sent even more. Colin placed the telemetry beside the rainfall record and the basin geometry. He could now estimate how high the water would have risen without pumping. His preliminary model showed the lawful east outlet, if left open, had enough capacity to keep the water below the western culvert during the actual storm. That appeared to answer the central question. Miriam warned me. It answered only the hydraulic part. We still have to show who closed the outlet, who selected the west route, and what they knew when they did it, she said. The pump logs had no names. The steel plates had no signatures. The missing attachment still had not been produced. We had proved machinery changed the water, not whose decision it carried out. Discovery consumed spring through requests, objections, narrowed orders, drafts, calendars, and messages. Each group filled one gap and exposed another. The contractor's foreman gave a sworn deposition in May. He said Northcrest hired his company to provide emergency bypass capacity. While the east outlet was under evaluation, his crew delivered 2 pumps 3 days before the storm. They had been shown the west inspection culvert during a site walk with Elaine and the association manager. When Miriam asked who ordered the steel plates, he pointed to a change order from Northcrest. When she asked who chose the final hose route, he said the crew followed stakes already placed beside the west culvert. He did not know who placed them. The change order carried Elaine's electronic signature. It authorized the pump rental, temporary restriction of the east outlet, and a west relief route. Its listed attachments included drawing B4 and an emergency operations sheet. Northcrest had produced neither one. That document gave us apparent leverage. It connected Elaine to the equipment and contradicted the claim that the contractor invented the bypass after the rain began. but the wording remained broad. A west relief route could mean discharge to the vegetated swale within the easement rate. It did not necessarily mean 18-inch hoses running at industrial volume. Elaine testified that she approved equipment availability, not field placement. She said she trusted licensed professionals to operate within the easement and had never seen drawing B4. Asked why her emergency water control notice was prepared 4 days before the storm. She said good boards plan before emergencies. Asked why she described the meadow as a secondary detention area in the proposed agreement. She called it settlement language drafted by counsel. Her answers were disciplined. They did not have to be true to remain possible. Miriam requested the native change order package. Northcrest said the contractor controlled it. The contractor cited an older server. The judge ordered cooperation with a neutral electronic record specialist. Meanwhile, Elaine scheduled a membership vote to ratify the board's decisions and warned residents that rejection could endanger insurance and expose every household to my claims. Miriam told me not to campaign. A member vote could not enlarge an easement or legalize past trespass, but it could show whether Elaine retained control. Northcrest's attorney framed the dispute as 92 homes against one field and displayed the $6 million appraisal. Elaine promised ratification would protect services before the next winter. Residents asked why the east outlet had not been repaired. She said the board had been evaluating all options. They asked whether she had disclosed the drainage issue to her real estate clients. She said personal transactions were unrelated to community safety. The ratification passed, but not comfortably. It authorized the board to defend the lawsuit and pursue emergency access. It did not approve permanent storage on my land. 2 days later, Northcrest asked the court to expand the temporary order before the autumn rains. Its new filing relied on the ratification vote and its engineer's model. The association requested permission to enter red alder, lower the irrigation berm, widen the west swale, and install monitoring equipment. It also asked the judge to declare that I bore comparative responsibility for leaving the berm in place after receiving a flood warning. That was the counterattack Miriam had expected, though its timing still hurt. If the request succeeded, Northcrest would gain physical access to the disputed area before trial. Any new excavation could erase the very elevations Colin needed to defend. If we refused a court-authorized safety plan and another storm caused damage uphill, the association would say I had chosen evidence over people. Northcrest also served a settlement offer. It would pay part of the documented cleanup, withdraw its public accusations, and fund improvements to the stone barn. In return, I would grant a permanent emergency flowage right and release the board members personally. The amount would have kept the ranch operating. My bank had become less patient. The lower meadow had missed an entire production season. Temporary livestock facilities were costing money each week. I read the offer alone at Ruth's bench, now dry but stained with a brown line along one leg. For the first time, I considered accepting a right I knew did not exist. I called Miriam the next morning and asked one question: could the permanent easement be capped at a safe volume? Perhaps, she said, but Northcrest is not offering a measured volume. It is asking for emergency discretion. That was the phrase Elaine had used from the beginning. Discretion without a number had put water in the barn. I rejected the offer. I also agreed that a safe interim plan was necessary. We proposed remote monitoring on both sides of the boundary, an automatic alert shared with the county, and a requirement that all emergency discharge use the restored east outlet. Northcrest refused. It said a west option had to remain available. The hearing was set for early September. 1 week before it, the neutral specialist recovered the contractor's original project package. Drawing B4 showed 2 possible hose routes. The first ran east toward the county ditch. The second ran west through the inspection culvert. A note beside the west route said that off-site permission was required before use. The emergency operations sheet repeated that warning and set a maximum basin elevation below the western culvert floor. Elaine's signature appeared on the package cover, not on either attachment. Northcrest argued the cover proved only receipt, while its attorney said the recovered warnings actually supported the board. Professionals had designed safeguards, and any departure belonged to the field crew. Then the specialist found a signed handoff sheet for the wireless pump controller. Elaine had accepted it at the clubhouse on February 10. The recovered access table showed that speed changes required a personal 6-digit administrator code, and the only administrator credential issued that week belonged to Elaine. We now knew who possessed the device and whose code could change the pumps. We still needed proof that the credential had not been shared. Northcrest filed one final technical exhibit. Its engineer recalculated the old benchmark and lowered BM 417.2 enough to place the west culvert within the predicted natural flood level. Under that exhibit, the controller question mattered less. Pumped water and natural water would have reached the same place. Holland studied the conversion table for nearly an hour. Then he asked for my original photograph of the brass disc, the one taken while water crossed the wall. He put it beside the 1999 plan and said, "They converted the drawing but not the monument." I did not understand him yet. At the September hearing, Colin explained it. The old plan used a local project elevation. Northcrest's engineer treated BM 417.2 as if it were a different regional datum and subtracted an adjustment that had already been accounted for. On paper, their conversion lowered the culvert by nearly 2 feet. A survey tied the brass disc to the county network and matched the original project note within a fraction of an inch. The brass disc proved the land had never moved. My photograph showed the flood above that point. The county rain gauge and Colin's model showed natural water would have remained below the west culvert if the east outlet had stayed open. The HOA attorney challenged the photograph's angle. Miriam produced my continuous video, the original memory card, and the county supervisor's image taken 20 minutes later. Each showed the same water line against the same disc. Then the pump vendor authenticated the controller history. The start commands and speed increases came from the handheld unit Elaine had signed for under her assigned administrator ID. Every speed change required her 6-digit code and a confirmation sent to her HOA phone. During the night, the contractor's foreman sent an alert through the same system. West discharge exceeded the operations sheet. Off-site, permission was unconfirmed, and the east outlet should be opened. 12 minutes later, after a confirmation from Elaine's phone, the controller increased both pumps. The foreman resisted the wording when he testified. He said he could not see who held the device. Miriam agreed. Custody alone was an inference, not proof. The vendor log and the phone export supplied the missing link. 2 minutes after the foreman's warning, Elaine's HOA phone sent him a preserved message. Continue, west at full rate. Hold the east plates until I clear it. Elaine admitted sending it, but said she acted to prevent an overtopping near homes. Holland showed that opening the east outlet would have lowered the basin faster than pumping west. The steel plates had disabled the safer route. One fact removed the natural flow defense, a second removed the contractor choice defense, a third removed emergency necessity. The judge denied Northcrest access to my ranch and ordered the east outlet professionally restored under county supervision. She did not decide damages that day. She found enough evidence to preserve the property and prevent another forced discharge until trial. Outside court, Elaine told residents the ruling limited the board's tools during dangerous weather. Miriam and I said nothing. The measurements were filed. The flood produced 3 proceedings, not one. Mine concerned the ranch. The state's concerned pollution. The homeowners concerned the board. Their schedules were coordinated in Alder County, but each involved different parties and remedies. The first was Owen Barrett v. Northcrest Hills Homeowners Association, Elaine Porter and the drainage contractor. Trespass, nuisance, damage, and an injunction. Elaine had been added as an individual defendant after the authenticated controller records and phone messages were produced. Before trial, Miriam sought permission to add punitive damages. After a hearing on those records, Elaine's message, and the withheld drawing, the court allowed the claim. Northcrest's insurer defended under a reservation of rights, leaving coverage to separate negotiation. The second track belonged to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Its inspectors documented petroleum residue and construction sediment in water discharge toward the Ranch Creek, where it could enter waters of the state. The agency issued a cleanup and monitoring order. The state then sought civil penalties in its own enforcement petition, coordinated with our case only for overlapping witnesses and laboratory evidence. The third track came from inside Northcrest. 5 homeowners, more than 5% of the membership, petitioned for judicial dissolution, or as a less drastic alternative, appointment of a limited custodian under Oregon nonprofit law. They alleged undisclosed conflicts, misuse of reserves, and illegal or oppressive management. I did not bring those claims. I was not a member, and had no standing to accuse Elaine of breaching a duty to the association. The homeowners served the directors, exchanged records, and obtained a separate evidentiary hearing. My trial began the following January. Miriam built the case in the order the water had moved. the east outlet was covered. Pumps forced collected water through a culvert above the natural storm level. Elaine received the written warning, authenticated the increase from her phone, and told the crew to continue west. Northcrest's attorney argued that directors facing a storm cannot calculate like engineers in a quiet courtroom. Colin answered that emergency judgment allowed imperfect choices. It did not explain closing the safer outlet before the rain or ignoring a written limit. The private judgment found Northcrest exceeded the easement and that the association and contractor caused the flood through trespass and nuisance. The court awarded $5.2 million in compensatory damages for restoration, lost operations, emergency expenses, and loss of use. The compensatory award excluded environmental work funded under the separate DEC order. It allocated $2 million in punitive damages between Northcrest and Elaine. The judge found clear and convincing evidence of reckless and outrageous indifference, then separately reviewed proportionality. Oregon law controlled distribution of that amount. The environmental case produced $1.3 million in civil penalties, payable to the state, and a $2.5 million cleanup and 5-year monitoring obligation. The homeowner case secured a $2 million supervised drainage reserve to rebuild the east outlet and correct the basin. Together, the separate obligations totaled $13 million. It was not one fine. Costs received a separate judgment, while attorney or expert fees required a statute, order, or settlement. Governance was decided at its own hearing. The judge found dissolution too drastic, but found temporary corporate control necessary, after testimony on the conflicts, missing attachments, and threatened use of association funds for personal liability. She appointed a limited custodian under Oregon nonprofit law. The order defined the custodian's powers, suspended the sitting directors from accounts, contracts, records, and drainage decisions, protected essential road and safety reserves, and required transparent statements and a supervised election. Northcrest remained intact, and its homeowners kept essential services. The board simply no longer controlled them. Northcrest and the contractor filed notices of appeal and asked to stay the orders. The court required a supersedious undertaking to secure collection of the private money judgment. It refused to pause the safety injunction, the environmental cleanup, or the custodian's work because the drainage risk continued. Elaine did not surrender the keys that afternoon. 72 hours later, after the emergency stay request failed, she transferred the controller, office keys, and records under assigned inventory. There were no handcuffs and no cheering crowd. The insurer later funded the portions tied to covered negligence through a separate settlement, and the contractor paid its agreed share of restoration and drainage work. The remaining appeals narrowed to punitive liability and corporate control, then were withdrawn after the secured payments, and settlement terms were approved. The custodian's review showed Northcrest could remain solvent if non-essential projects paused and drainage work was properly bid. 6 months later, members elected a new board with spending limits and independent review. I never joined it. Red Alder was still outside Northcrest. The new board invited me to its drainage review. I attended as a neighboring owner. Nobody described my meadow as a community resource. They discussed outlet capacity, alarms, inspections, and the person responsible for each signature. When one director asked what should happen if an emergency exceeded the design, the county engineer said public authorities would coordinate it. No board could assign another person's land to the problem. The judgments did not repair anything by themselves. The custodian opened controlled accounts, required competing bids, and released money as inspectors verified each stage. Collection against intentional actors proceeded separately, without draining essential reserves. For the first time since the flood, I could schedule ranch work against written dates instead of hopeful conversations. Before construction started, Colin walked the entire flow path with the county engineer, the custodian's consultant, and me. We marked what would be removed, what had to remain for evidence, and where temporary erosion controls would stand. The new plan restored the east outlet, added redundant alarms, and prohibited any west discharge above the easement limit. A monitor beside the brass benchmark reported only elevation. It did not give Northcrest access or control. Every party signed the field plan before the first machine entered. I kept a copy in the same binder as Elaine's original notice. The contrast between those two documents was quiet but complete. One announced authority after a private decision, while the other defined responsibility before anyone touched the ground. Restoration took most of a year. Crews removed contaminated sediment in measured sections instead of scraping the whole meadow bare. The irrigation berm was rebuilt with wider spill gaps after Colin documented its small contribution to water distribution. That detail remained in the final report. Winning did not require pretending my property was perfect. The stone barn needed its south corner underpinned and its electrical system replaced. We kept the basalt walls and the red doors. The lower field passed testing after new soil and a full growing cycle. Our seed certification returned the following spring. On the first wet morning after cattle moved back into the barn, I sat beneath the south eave with my yellow notebook. Ruth's bench still carried a faint stain near one leg. Beyond it, the meadow drained toward the creek in narrow, ordinary lines. Uphill, the rebuilt Northcrest outlet sent water east through the route shown on the original plan. I closed the flood binder after the final inspection report arrived. It held no single page that had won the case. The notice proved planning. The easement defined the limit. The plates explained the rising basin. The telemetry measured the pumps. The benchmark fixed the elevation. The warning and controller record established the choice. Facts become strong when they agree with one another. I did not save Red Alder by making the loudest accusation. I saved it by recording what existed before anyone had time to rename it. If a board tried to turn your property into its emergency solution, what would you document first?